We are this morning going to consider the study of the book of Proverbs. All those wise sayings that if we apply them to ourselves would do a lot to change our lives in many, many good ways. We will this morning consider the topic of being a friend or a neighbor. In the Proverbs, the word for translated friend and neighbor are the same word. And so we are to treat our neighbors as friend. It reminds me of the advertising, like a good neighbor, we ought to be there. We ought to be. But what makes you a friend of your neighbor? What makes you a friend of your neighbor? We often would think about the things we ought to do for them. The earliest verses in the book of Proverbs are really about what we don't do. If you're really going to be a true friend to your neighbor, what would you not do? Look at Proverbs 3 and verse 29. Actually, I think we'll start in verse 27. Proverbs 3, verse 27. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it, when you have it with you. Do not devise harm against your neighbor while he lives securely beside you. A lot of what you don't do. A good neighbor is reluctant to start any kind of strife, while seeking to harm him in some way, to perhaps even deceive them, to have in your possession what is due to them, but to say you don't have it and just, well, you're going to have to come back later and get it. You know, you're just not playing those kind of games, so to speak, with people. A friend does not take advantage of the neighbor, and in that sense, described there is to manipulate them. You have something for them, give it to them. And so he doesn't frustrate the plans of others. This thing about abusing a neighbor that lives right beside you in a big way reminded me of down in Texas and anywhere where there's big concern about oil and mineral rights. Somebody could have a vast tract of land and they could drill a well on their own land, but turn the pipe and run a mile to the side and tap out of their neighbor's oil. And I guess here the parallel would be to abuse somebody's water rights. No, you just don't stir up that kind of strife. And so it could simply be a matter of what we say or how we might look down upon a neighbor, that you might want to hold back what they're due. Just, why not go ahead and take care of it if that's what he's due? Why manipulate people in that way? On the other hand, in Proverbs 25, verses 8 and 10, Proverbs 25, verse 8 through 10. Do not go out hastily to argue your case. Otherwise, what will you say in the end when your neighbor humiliates you? Argue your case with your neighbor and do not reveal the secret of another, or he who hears it will reproach you, and the evil report about you will not pass away. Quite the picture there. What if the neighbor has caused some strife to you? How do you respond to that? Do you just run out and get in their face? What if you don't know all the facts? Is really the point of this. What if you really don't understand all that's going on?
Now, when they're talking about neighbor in this Proverbs,
yep.
Is that Christian neighbors?
Any. You know, in a broad sense, this is just general practices, a high standard of living for anybody. Certainly it would apply to us in a we might say in a double portion, but it applies to everyone. This thing about going out to hastily make your case against the neighbor reminds me of, so often my mom said when a couple of the grandkids would get in a scrap, what'd she say?
One dog don't bite itself.
One dog don't bite itself. It takes two to fight. And you better know why you're biting when you go for it, Because what if you don't understand? And the neighbor comes back to you with, a reasonable explanation, one that's proven true. Who's the shame upon? Yes?
It's good to tell a story.
Okay.
The first house we ever bought, we had the neighbors from hell. For 8 years, they persecuted us. The thing was that we had just become Christians and learned about turning the other cheek. So that was a good lesson in patience and not retaliating.
Yep, that's
And
exactly
it
the
was-
point.
So after that, we were really good at, just letting everything just go off your back if
Yeah.
someone says or does something bad to you.
And that's part of what he's describing here. There's a great deal of discretion necessary in it. I mean, if you do know something about your neighbor, well, the problem is sometimes if you go telling news about your neighbor, it's going to backfire on you. And who's the reproach going to be against? I don't wish I could count it now. There's too many times in my life where I went out and got in somebody's face too fast, and who was the one that wound up being ashamed? Sometimes we can do that.
That's why God says our tongue is like a two-edged sword,
Yeah.
because we speak sometimes.
And he also speaks of it, how it controls us and directs us to act foolishly sometimes. Much like you were talking about, Carol, there's been a couple of neighbors in recent years, if I would let myself go, I would like to go out and fix their little red wagon. But when I think through it more sanely, whatever I've let myself even think, if I think it through, it all backfire on me. I'd just be stirring up more trouble for myself. And so there's no need to spread that kind of strife. In Proverbs 25 there in verse 9, there's do not reveal the secret of another. There's reason for discretion. There's a lot of times you can assume what's going on in your neighbor's house, and it's not what's happening at all. And so why would you put yourself in that position of spreading what is not true? So in the sum of that little passage there, obtain all the information first. Understand all the circumstances. And you may find, as you did, Carol, it's best not to say or do anything. Just not easy, but best not to say anything. Why is that? Because the good neighbor is kind and generous in their judgments. Look at chapter 24 and verse 17. I mean, if this is one of those neighbors where you might think, I can't wait till they get theirs. Certainly not a righteous way of thinking, but chapter 24, verse 17, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles. Or the Lord will see it and be displeased, and turn his anger away from him. What's the basic message of that? To hate others is certainly wickedness before God. To in your own way celebrate when we think somebody gets what's coming to them. It's not ours. Vengeance is, of course, the Lord's. In verse 18, when the Lord sees your joy in their calamity, how ought we be seen instead of rejoicing in their calamity? Well, a good neighbor is trying to help them through it. And so, if not, then, well, again, it's sometimes wiser. Sometimes silence is wiser than criticism, isn't it? If a good neighbor, it controls himself or herself by not saying what they think. You know, it's kind of real easy sometimes. Did you see so-and-so get what's coming to them? No. That's certainly not what God desires to see. Proverbs 11, chapter 12 and 13, or chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. He who despises his neighbor lacks sense, but a man of understanding keeps silent. He who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy conceals the matter. So much about discretion in this, isn't it? You don't have to tell everything you know or everything you assume about somebody, because typically you probably don't understand it as well as you think you do. How many times have you thought you knew what was going on in somebody's life and you really didn't? Of course, we should seek to know to the extent that we can help. But there's a lot of things that just ought not be told. Dina and I have a basic policy of if somebody comes to her and confides something in her, she doesn't tell me. And I do the same. If somebody's going to trust me enough to share that with me, they need to know that it's going no further than me. And yes, a lot of things you hear that just don't need to be told, because in the telling of it, you're destroying the opportunity to actually help that person. And so sometimes it's one of the things, if you can't say anything good, then hold your tongue till you can. And in a timely manner, when it's possible, help the one who has failed. Look at Proverbs 14 and verse 21. I mean, in the right timing, then the good neighbor will help, rather than hold the other one in contempt. Proverbs 14 and verse 21. He who despises his neighbor sins, but happy is he who is gracious to the poor. Poor in that sense meaning needy, the one in the midst of their calamity, that you could help. You say, no, not going to do that. Yes.
Well, I got an issue. I take care of a 92-year-old
Mm-hmm.
woman. And every time I come back the first day, it is holy, terrible. Really, really bad. And I know it's because the other girls just give in to her all the time. And so when I get back, she expects me to do the same thing. So the first day, I am not kind. I'm not patient. And I'm not that kind of person. But then after that, the second day, everything's back to normal, because I don't hold a grudge, because she's 92, but she is a very highly intelligent 92-year-old. She has not lost her marbles at all. She learned that.
So she knows how to work the situation.
Oh my gosh, horrible. And so my problem is if I give in to her, then she knows she's beat me, and I can't do that, because it's not healthy for either one of us. Now I don't hold a grudge. So if I don't stand my ground and try to get her to see what she's doing is not okay. So where do you kind of draw the line of, that type of situation?
On the other end of the scale, it would be much like dealing with young children.
It is.
Very much like it.
Throwing a fit. Right.
And ultimately you have to look toward the result. Are you doing any good for her not to hold the line? Well, that's what I'm implying.
Yeah, because if I separate from her,
It's
all sad and does a fake crying and all that stuff.
It's not to her good to go whichever way she wants. I mean,
At all.
When I worked with special needs kids, they'd go home for the weekend, and the parents, a lot of those parents just did not, didn't understand, or they didn't have the patience, they just were all done. They let them do whatever they wanted
Yeah.
over the weekend. Monday was always so hard.
Yeah.
And I had to just dig my toes in and hang on, but it always worked for the best, because those children wanted the boundaries, and I think she does too.
That's what I told Andy this morning.
It's because it's like a safety net. You know, okay, I can bump the line, but you're not gonna let me go where I fall off the edge. And that's, you gotta look at it that way. And every day I have to steal myself away and expect the good. When I expected the good, most of the time, I got better. If I expected it to be hard, it was always hard.
I just listened to that on a preacher saying that, so, okay, thank you.
The latter part of that, chapter 14, verse 21, but happy is he who is gracious to the poor. The one who there is in the better state, maybe wealthy or whatever, in relation to the one who is in need. It reminds me of the quote I shared with you last week. When we're prospering, if we were wealthy, rather than building walls between those we need to help, we would build a bigger table. And you invite them to partake of your blessing, to share it with them. In other words, look at chapter 21 and verse 10. If I don't desire good for my neighbor, we're not talking about doing any action against my neighbor, but if I just don't desire what is good for my neighbor, what am I? Chapter 21, verse 10. The soul of the wicked desires evil. His neighbor finds no favor in his eye. So if I'm devising some kind of, even just thinking about it, not praying that for good for that person. I haven't outwardly done anything, but that's wickedness. Wickedness to not desire what is good for that neighbor. In that same passage there. That word for wicked is often translated as criminal. It is criminal to not be the friend to one who is in need. Criminal. Certainly that's wicked. On the other hand, look at Proverbs 22, beginning in verse 24. Again, so many of these passages are about our associations and how we associate with one another. Chapter 22 and verse 24. Do not associate with a man given to anger, or go with a hot-tempered man, or you will learn his ways and find a snare for yourself. This one seems to say to me, with those who you associate with, maybe they're very different people than you are. Maybe they have a whole different set of values than you do. And you think, well, to be a friend, I've got to sort of be friendly to every way. This seems to be describing that you don't just go along to get along. How easy is it to associate with, let's just take an obvious example, somebody that is forever cursing. I used to work with a guy and he had a universal adjective that applied to everything. And so it was about every third word and every sentence he said. And it's real easy to be around that and start picking it up, isn't it? And sometimes you think, well, we're working together, we got to get along. So, no. So that notion that, well, I'll just go along to get along. No. It's kind of that notion, well, whatever will be, just got to roll with it. What's the other old song? Everything is beautiful in its own way. No, it's not. It's not. A good neighbor would actually know when to say no. And to be able to kindly say no. Look at Proverbs chapter 6. I mean, there's a way to say no and be firm about it. Just as a parent would say no to a son. Proverbs chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. My son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge for a stranger, if you have been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth, do this then, my son, and deliver yourself. Since you have come into the hand of your neighbor, go humble yourself and importune your neighbor. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Talking about how we do business with others. If you've given yourself, if you've co-signed a loan for someone, or if you have vouched for somebody else's credibility, and you're going to be the one held accountable for that, if you are accountable for it, how quickly should you take care of it? First off, he's saying you ought to be very, very cautious about vouching for somebody else or making yourself the guarantor of somebody else's loans. But if you are and it comes back on you, then take care of it. Again, just get out of that situation as quickly as you can. Why? Really for your reputation. For your reputation. You've said you would do this, just do it. The main idea of this is to treat business and financial dealings with great caution. And either way, they're to be resolved as soon as possible. Interesting, he compares it to a gazelle. How quick does it take an animal like a gazelle to jump? I guess we could compare it to an antelope around here. That's why they're so skittish, isn't it? They're so skittish. On the other hand, a good friend is not so skittish. I mean, in an appropriate situation, the true friend is dependable. Chapter 14 and verse 20. From this we gather that a true friend is not a fair weather friend. The poor is hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many. Yeah, the classic story is as soon as you win the lottery, you got neighbors, so-called neighbors, crawling out of the woodwork. But, you know, this kind of thing is an observation of life's reality, not the way it ought to be, but just really the way that it is. Those kind of false allegiances that people will put forth to see what they can get out of you, to manipulate again. It is as in Proverbs 19 verses 4 through 7. This whole manner of wealth, of course, Solomon had more of it than he could count. He's also experienced all these things he's talked about. Who wouldn't want to seek the favor of the super wealthy king? But he's very realistic about wealth in chapter 19, verses 4 through 7. Wealth adds many friends, but a poor man is separated from his friend. A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will not escape. Many will seek the favor of a generous man, and every man is a friend to him who gives gifts. All the brothers of a poor man hate him. Why is that? Despise him in other ways. Why is that? Yeah, they can't get anything out of him. They're not really brothers anyway. How much more do his friends abandon him? Hey, you know, it's probably the most common trait of any among humans is just that one phrase, what's in it for me? Isn't that what's naturally on, ever since the garden, what's in it for me? That's the problem. So when you have much, everybody wants to go, well, you know, wants to know, where's my part? Again, it's not the way it ought to be, but that's just the way it is, isn't it? The poor man, or the one in need, is separated from the friend. He's often cut off. All the brothers of a poor man despise him. I wonder wonder if this is sometimes why we have in larger congregations, you have a deacon for benevolence. Because people can say, let him take care of it. If I have the means to take care of somebody in needs and do it myself, why ought I pass it off to somebody else when you can do it yourself? I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but, it reminds me of James's teaching, how you treat the wealthy or the poor when they come into the assembly, and this one you prefer, and that one, well, you just soon they'd leave.
Remember how many times we tried to find a congregation in another part of the country to go visit someone in prison to help
Yeah.
them out and bring, and they were desperately wanting to study the Bible, and we got the answer we didn't.
Yeah, I've told some of you that.
It was a horrible shock. It was like, what? What do you mean you don't do that?
Yeah, a young man was in serious trouble, and it was trouble of his own causing. I mean, there wasn't any doubt about that, but still in a time when he was truly in need emotionally, and you call a place and, oh no, we don't do that.
And now that young man has driven off so far, I don't know if there's any reaching back out to him.
No, not with that kind of response. And so the genuine friend we see in chapter 18 and verse 24. A man of too many friends comes to ruin. But there is a friend. This is the classic one we know. There is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. How many of us have found at times that maybe a friend is closer and more supportive to us than a blood kin? This really is a picture that whatever the circumstances, that bond cannot be broken. Not a fair weather friend. That bond is always there. There is again a sense that sometimes a friend might be better than a brother. Look at Proverbs 17 and verse 17, the same thought. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Again, the circumstances aren't going to change the friendship, are they? If anything else, it makes it even stronger. There's a sense, there's this strong, enduring interdependence. To be closer than a brother, that's an interdependence, an abiding one. It's unbreakable. There's no thought of forsaking that friend for any reason. If you would look over at chapter 27 and verse 10. Proverbs 27 verse 10. Do not forsake your own friend or your father's friend. Do not go to your brother's house in the day of your calamity. Better it is a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far away. It doesn't mean not to go to your brother. It's a comparative generality. Go to the nearest person in your time of need. The friend might be more gracious to you than your closest kin. How many of us has found it sometimes easier in a time of severe need to go to somebody who's a friend and not your blood kin? Is there things you might entrust to this friend that is so close to you? You know, what can you find sometimes among kinfolks? It can be a little brutal sometimes. It's easier sometimes to accept candid criticism from a friend. You know, he talks about the father and the son here. There's this whole family dynamic, you know. This is who we are. This is how we are. And it's just easier sometimes to go to this friend. A good friend will, with very frank, being frank but also in love, offer honest criticism. That same chapter 27 and verse 6. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. So the faithful friend comes to you and gives you that counsel that you don't want to hear. And for a time your emotions are bruised, you're maybe even feeling abused and broken by what they have said. But that doesn't change the credibility of what they said. Far better to hear that than somebody that comes up and flatters all of your faults, or just flatters you for the sake of, well, in a sense, schmoozing you. They act like they care, but it's really dishonest. Let me show you one more verse, and then I'll give you an example of that. Proverbs 29 and verse 5. Proverbs 9 and verse 5. A man who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his steps. Again, I keep coming up with the word schmooze. You know, when you're just playing up to somebody really to gain some advantage, to gain some favor, it's going to backfire on you. Is spreading a net for his steps. The duplicity is ultimately going to be seen, isn't it? This one reminds me, when I talk about schmoozing, about Eddie Haskell. Remember Eddie Haskell on Leave It to Beaver? What was his way? He'd come in the room and oh, what a beautiful dress you're wearing today, Mrs. Cleaver. And then he'd turn around and give Beaver the business, wouldn't he? So he's going to schmooze Ms. Cleaver to gain some sort of favor, but Beaver can't do anything for him, so give Beaver the business, as they always called it. Eddie, that guy that played Eddie Haskell, died about 2 weeks ago, and he had said later in life that just playing that role had marked him throughout his entire life. People had seen him do that so well. Schmoozing the one who thought he could gain something from, but being so brutal with those who were helpless. And he was marked by that, he said. He never really moved beyond it. People didn't trust him. Well, he had, as that said, he had laid and was snared by the net that he had laid for himself, even if it was just a TV. Yeah. But don't we know it when somebody's just really laying it on a little bit too thick? You know, it's one thing to be kind, but to flatter somebody, even their faults. On the other hand, what about compliments? Rather than compliments, what about rebukes? Proverbs 28, verse 23. He who rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than he who flatters with the tongue. We've seen this in relation to the topic of wisdom. The one who receives the rebuke, another passage just says, he has gained more knowledge, has gained more wisdom, and so the one that rebuked him would be seen with even greater favor. You'd appreciate the one that would, in the right spirit, rebuke you as necessary. It's assuming both parties are wise, but I would value you more for a careful rebuke than I would for you flattering my faults. Don't we all know our faults when we really get down to it? Well, I wouldn't say all, but generally people know their faults. I don't need somebody coming up and, say, oh, you're just so wonderful in all those ways. And so a friend's rebuke is certainly then appreciated. In both cases, either a sincere compliment or a sincere rebuke. Good friends mutually receive and give counsel as the situation merits. The apostles were masters at this, weren't they? Think about Paul's many letters. He starts off the letter, "Blessed are you, my beloved, we this common faith we share, born into the kingdom of God," and all this, and commending them for all their works of faith and all they do so well. It wasn't flattery, it was fact. But also fact was what comes after the but. There was always a but, wasn't there, Gary? And both of them were true. Both the celebration of their fellowship, that's true. But what came after it's also true.
The motive is what's different. His motive is always love. Whenever a friend comes to rebuke you in love, it's hard to hear. But when you really, really love someone, you're going to tell them the truth. You're not going to let them step off the edge of the cliff at all. You can help it. Sometimes what you say doesn't do any good, but we are commanded to try. But it has to be with that motive of love. If we're telling them that so that we can look better, or that we can revel in their folly, then it shouldn't work. Our motive has to be that we truly love.
Talk about the motive of love. Although the Pharisees mocked Jesus for dining with tax collectors and sinners, they accused him of being a friend of tax collectors and sinners. They were mocking him, but wasn't it in fact true? It was true, in a sense. Jesus was the friend of sinners. Absolutely. This word for friend is the word for philos, the word for brotherly love. Jesus loved sinners as he would love brothers. And friends in this sense, again, as you brought up the word motivation, it's friends because of this deep concern for the other's welfare. Friends.
I saw a post this morning, and I thought it was really amazing. It was about the scripture when Lazarus died, Jesus wept. It said he wept even after he already knew he was gone. He wept even though he knew he was going to bring him back to life. He wept even though he knew where he was going was so much better than staying here on earth. He wept because of all the sorrow and that the other people were feeling, and the sorrow of sin. And all those things, and I kept thinking about that, just that deep compassion that we need to be motivated by to see past maybe the action right at that moment, but to be moved by the whole picture. And I think that's what that verse is, little bitty verse in sense that Jesus, even though he knew exactly what he was going to do and what was going to happen and why it was going to happen, yet he still felt compassion.
We'll close this morning. I want to give you from Scripture just 3 definitions of friends. John 15, verse 13, one that you certainly know well. Let's start in verse 12. John 15, verse 12. "This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Well, the word for love and the word for friends are the same root there, philos. There's a different word for friends in Acts chapter 24 and verse 23. Acts 24, verse 23. "Then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody, and yet have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him." This is the word idios. It has nothing to do with being an idiot, but about your ideals. You have the same values, the same mindset as this friend. So you're not going to prevent these friends, those who would have this bond in like values and beliefs, from ministering to him. It's the best kind of friends, isn't it? When you're friends of the heart and the mind, having the same value, and in that way are very much alike each other. And one more word that's translated as friends is in Matthew chapter 25, Matthew 5 in verse 25. And I just wrote down the wrong, that's not, I'm in Mark. That's why it doesn't look right. I go, whoa. Okay, Matthew 5, verse 25. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you're with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Make friends quickly. This word is enoeo. The noeo is a strong word for knowledge. There's several words for knowledge. This is knowledge with a conviction. What's the conviction? You're finding grounds for agreement. Oh, this person is your opponent. You don't want to leave it that way. But you know how you can come to agreement, how this can be resolved. So 3 kinds of friendship. The one that's like a brother, the one who has a like mind, like values, and the one who knows, who desires to find agreement. Many of those Proverbs mention that right from the start. If you're bound in someone in business, if you owe someone something, don't tell them you don't have it when you do. That's certainly not the meaning, an example of being a friend. But do all things quickly. Prove yourself to be a good neighbor. I guess we better stop right there then for today.